For centuries, Christians around the world have told a simple story about the gospel. The story begins in Israel, where Jesus of Nazareth appears, teaches, and is proclaimed as the Messiah. Then the message spreads beyond the borders of Israel. It crosses languages, cultures, and empires until the nations of the world begin to believe in the God of Israel. To many believers, that seems like the natural ending of the story. The gospel began with the Jews, and then it moved on to the nations. But what if that familiar story is missing something important? What if the writings of the Apostle Paul reveal a pattern hidden beneath the surface of the gospel itself? A pattern that begins in Israel, reaches the nations, and then points back again to Israel in a way few people have ever noticed. In one remarkable passage, Paul describes the salvation of the nations with a phrase that almost sounds shocking. Through their trespass, salvation has come to the Gentiles, to make Israel jealous. Why would the faith of the nations provoke Israel? What role were the nations meant to play in the unfolding story of God? And what did Paul believe might happen if Israel one day looked again at its own Messiah? To answer those questions, we have to return to a chapter of Scripture that many believers have read, but very few have explored deeply. A chapter about an olive tree, a chapter about branches grafted in, and a chapter that reveals the relationship between Israel and the nations in a way that changes how the entire story of the gospel is understood. Because according to Paul, when the message of the Messiah reached the nations, that was not the end of the story. In many ways, it was only the beginning. To understand the mystery Paul describes, we have to return to the beginning of the story itself. Long before the message of the gospel spread across continents, before churches appeared throughout the Roman world, the story was rooted in one small land and one ancient people. Jesus of Nazareth did not appear in Rome, Athens, or Alexandria. He appeared in Israel. He was born among the people of Israel, raised within their traditions, and taught from their scriptures. His disciples were Jews who had grown up hearing the promises given to their ancestors. The language of the prophets, the covenant with Abraham, the story of Moses and David, these were not distant religious ideas to them. They were the very fabric of their identity. When Jesus spoke about the kingdom of God, he was speaking into a story that had already been unfolding for centuries among the people of Israel. And when his followers began proclaiming that the Messiah had come, they were not announcing the birth of a new religion. They believed they were witnessing the fulfillment of promises that had belonged to Israel from the beginning. In those earliest days, the message of the Messiah did not spread outward into the nations. It remained within Israel, among Jews who believed that the long-awaited redemption of their people had finally begun. The first believers prayed in the temple courts. They gathered in the streets of Jerusalem. They spoke about the God of Israel and the Messiah of Israel. In every way, the movement that would later transform the world was still deeply rooted in the life of one people. The gospel did not begin as a global message detached from Israel. It began as the continuation of Israel's own story. A story in which the God who had spoken through the prophets was now acting in a way that would eventually draw the attention of the entire world. But the story does not remain confined within Israel for long. Within a few years, something remarkable begins to unfold. The message about Israel's Messiah starts moving beyond the borders of the land where it began. At the center of this turning point stands a man whose life itself seems to embody the tension between Israel and the nations. Saul of Tarsus, known to the world as Paul, was a Jew trained in the traditions of Israel, a student of the scriptures, a man deeply devoted to the God of his ancestors. Yet his life would become the bridge through which the message of Israel's Messiah traveled into the vast world of the Roman Empire. City after city, road after road, Paul journeys across regions that had never heard the story of Israel's God in this way before. Antioch, Corinth, Ephesus, Thessalonica, Rome. In each place, the same surprising scene begins to unfold. People from the nations Greeks, Romans, men and women who were not born into Israel's covenant story, begin to listen. They hear about the God of Abraham. They hear the ancient promises of the prophets. They hear the announcement that the Messiah of Israel has come. And something unexpected happens. They believe. Communities of believers begin appearing far beyond the land of Israel. In crowded port cities along Roman trade routes and homes and marketplaces across the empire, people from the nations begin worshiping the God of Israel. They open the scriptures that had once belonged only to Israel. They pray to the God who had revealed himself to the patriarchs. They speak about the Messiah who had walked the roads of Judea, To many observers, it would have looked like the center of the story was shifting. What began in Israel now seemed to be taking root among the nations of the world. And yet, as Paul traveled across the empire, he never believed that Israel's story had ended. In fact, everywhere he went, he followed the same deliberate pattern. Before speaking to the crowds of Gentiles, before teaching in the marketplaces or homes of the nations, Paul always began in the same place. He went first to the synagogue. He reasoned with the Jewish communities from the scriptures. Again and again, the same words appear in the book of Acts. Paul entered the synagogue and spoke with the Jews first. This was not a habit of convenience. It was a pattern he believed was deeply connected to the design of the gospel itself. Because Paul never saw the message of the Messiah as something that had moved on from Israel. Even as the nations began to believe, the story remained rooted in the people through whom it had first begun. And it is precisely at this moment, when the gospel is spreading rapidly among the nations, that Paul begins to explain a mystery that would reshape how the relationship between Israel and the nations should be understood. As the message of the Messiah continued spreading across the Roman world, a question naturally began to arise among the early believers. What did this growing faith among the nations mean for Israel? To many observers, the situation seemed to suggest that something had changed in the story of God. Israel had been the center of the covenant for centuries, yet now communities of Gentile believers were appearing everywhere. Had the nations replaced Israel? Had the story moved on from the people through whom it first began? When Paul writes to the believers in Rome, he confronts this question directly, and the answer he gives reveals what he calls a mystery. A mystery, not because it is hidden forever, but because it can only be understood when the entire story is seen together. To explain it, Paul uses an image from the natural world that every listener in the ancient Mediterranean would immediately recognize: an olive tree. In Paul's description, the tree represents the long story of God's covenant with Israel, the promises given to Abraham, the words spoken through the prophets, the faithfulness of God unfolding through generations. The roots of this tree run deep into the soil of Israel's history. But then Paul describes something unusual happening to that tree. Some branches are broken off and branches from a wild olive tree. Branches that did not originally belong are grafted into the cultivated tree. These wild branches represent the nations. People who were once strangers to the covenant of Israel are now being connected to the life flowing from that ancient root. For the first time, men and women from every nation are receiving the promises that had long been associated with the people of Israel. But Paul is careful to explain what this image does and does not mean. The nations are not a new tree replacing the old one. They are not the root of the story. They are branches that have been grafted into a story that existed long before they arrived. The root supports them, not the other way around. The God of Israel has not abandoned his covenant story. Instead, he has extended its life outward so that the nations themselves can share in its blessings. And this is where the mystery begins to deepen, because according to Paul, the presence of these new branches, the faith of the nations themselves, will eventually affect the original tree in a profound way. The story is not moving away from Israel. Instead, something about the faith of the nations will one day turn the attention of Israel back toward its own Messiah. In Paul's mind, the arrival of the nations into the covenant story was never meant to end Israel's role. It was meant to set the stage for something still unfolding in the future. This is where Paul's words begin to touch something deeper than theology. Because when he speaks about the nations being grafted into Israel's story, he is not describing a minor detail in the unfolding of the gospel. He is describing the role of millions of people who would one day come to believe in the God of Israel. People who were once strangers to the covenants, strangers to the promises, strangers to the scriptures of Israel. And yet, according to Paul, they were never meant to remain outsiders. They were invited into the living story of God's covenant with the world. But the astonishing part of Paul's message is that the nations were not simply invited to receive salvation and then stand quietly on the sidelines. Their faith itself was meant to become part of the unfolding drama of redemption. When the nations began worshiping the God of Abraham, reading the prophets of Israel, and believing in the Messiah who came through Israel, something entirely new was happening in human history. For the first time, the God of Israel was being honored by people from every nation under heaven. The ancient promises given to one people were now echoing across the world. And Paul believed that this moment would eventually speak back to Israel itself. Imagine what he envisioned. Jewish communities scattered throughout the Roman world and hearing reports that in distant cities, people who were not born into Israel's covenant were now praying to Israel's God, studying Israel's scriptures and placing their hope in Israel's Messiah. The nations were discovering the treasure that had once belonged only to Israel. And Paul believed that when Israel saw this, something powerful could happen. Not rivalry, not hostility, but a kind of longing. A realization that the promises given to their ancestors were still alive, still powerful, still changing lives. This is why Paul uses the word jealousy. Not the jealousy of resentment, but the longing that awakens when someone sees another person experiencing a blessing that once belonged to them. The faith of the nations becomes a living testimony that the God of Israel has not abandoned his promises, that the covenant story is still unfolding, that the Messiah of Israel is still drawing people into the life of God. And in this way, the nations are not merely recipients of grace. They become witnesses to it. Their lives become evidence that the God of Israel is not only the God of one people, but the God whose promises were always meant to reach the whole world. But even as Paul speaks about the privilege of the nations, he reminds them of something essential. The root still supports the branches. The story still begins with Israel. The promises still belong to the people through whom God first spoke to the world. The nations are not replacing that story. They are participating in it. They are living proof that the God of Israel is faithful to his covenant. And according to Paul, this participation carries a profound purpose. Because when the nations walk humbly within this story, honoring the root that supports them, loving the people through whom the promises first came, and living in the life of the Messiah, they may awaken something that has been waiting for generations. They may become part of the moment when Israel itself begins to look again at the Messiah who first came to them. And when that moment arrives, Paul hints that the consequences could reach far beyond Israel alone. The faith of the nations, he believed, could help prepare the world for a turning point in the story of redemption itself. Millions hear the story of Jesus through traditions shaped centuries later. This channel exists to rediscover the story as it began. This work is 100% supported by viewers like you. There is no organization behind it. If this work matters to you, consider becoming a member. The link is in the description.